Hi, my name is Ariana, and I am the health coach at Integrative Family Medicine of Asheville. I'm so happy to be able to speak with Dr. Will Hamilton today. Dr. Hamilton is a local psychologist here in Asheville. He studied at the Pacific Graduate School of Psychology in Palo Alto, California, and currently specializes in behavioral psychotherapy to, in particular, help individuals with chronic pain and ongoing health concerns. However, with a background that includes mindfulness and more, he brings a lot of expertise to how we can navigate challenges that are painful physically or emotionally while increasing our resilience along the way. And so as such, I'll dive right in and I'll say thank you so much for joining me today.
And thank you so much for the invitation.
Yeah.
If it's okay, one thing I thought kind of might start with, given all the sort of pandemic fatigue that's everyone's having, the type of therapy that I end up doing a lot of is known as acceptance and commitment therapy. And one of the things that type of therapy does quite a bit of is different exercises and different metaphors and kind of stories and things like that in order to help kind of clarify particular points.
Okay.
And so what I'd like to do to just start today's session, since part of the theme that we're working with is really around like the marathon of pandemic stress and how many people are just kind of a bit burnt out from coping with all the extra stresses that are here. Yep. I thought we might start with just a visualization exercise in order to kind of settle people into the session.
That sounds fantastic. Yeah.
So this exercise is known as the future compassionate self visualization. And so if you're sitting at home, I'll invite you to do this as well. What I'll have you do is just kind of close your eyes and go inside for a sec. And I'd like you to begin allowing your mind to paint a picture of your future compassionate self. So one way to do this is to start to take stock of the journey so far. And so that might involve somewhat reflecting on the journey of your life and the ways that you have grown or matured over that lifetime. Maybe when comparing yourself to previous versions of yourself, you might notice that you're more compassionate, better able to take perspectives, better able to show up in important relationships. And we want to just project that tendency forward in time and start to imagine what it could be like to continue that curve of growth. And so just allowing your mind to kind of pick a time in the future which feels like your future compassionate self. It could be a year from now, could be 5 years from now, 10 years, 20. Just find the kind of right place to work with. And just notice how your mind can start to paint in some of those details. You might notice what this future compassionate self, what their body looks like, or maybe what they're wearing. But maybe more importantly, what sort of facial expressions. And even more importantly, it's what sort of qualities of mind they have. So just noticing how your mind paints those details. So hopefully this is a more compassionate being, meaning that they're sensitive to the suffering of yourself and others, and they have a desire to relieve that suffering. But maybe there's more other kind of associations with that. So maybe this being is more capable of taking perspectives. Maybe they're more courageous or steadfast. Maybe they're calmer. Maybe they're more lighthearted or playful. So just noticing kind of what qualities of mind you want to grow. And then what I'd like you to do is, from your current self, from the year 2021, I want you to draw to mind some problem that you might have been faced with some difficulty or frustration. And I'd like you to offer it to this compassionate being. I'd like you to request their perspective or their take. What sort of guidance can they offer you? And if you're at home and you need a longer dialogue, you can go ahead and pause the video. I'm just going to wait for a minute before I move on. Okay. And if this feels skillful, I might invite you in order to write down whatever advice they may have given you. And then we'll start to bring this, this exercise to a close. First of all, we just want to thank this part of the mind. There's a natural feature of mind to have compassion. So we want to thank that part of the mind for being there. And then just ask it to kind of fade back into the background, knowing that we can draw up this part at any point that we want. And then we'll just tune the attention back to more of the present moment. You can tune the attention back to the sounds that are going on in your room or the sounds of my voice. And eventually you can turn the attention back to the visual impressions of closed eyes and eventually the visual impressions of eyes wide open. Thank you so much.
That was great.
Cool. Yeah.
Interesting to use the imagination to project a self that is more calm, steadfast, and we're easily able to interface with what's hard right now. Mm-hmm. And it's fun how that kind of just feels like a slight mental awakening to, oh, right, yeah, that could be right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's a curious thing in which one of the joys of doing compassion work with people is that those are completely natural, inborn biological structures in our brain. Often we know how to do a lot of this stuff already inherently. It's just that very often we're too threatened, we're too overwhelmed to kind of have access to that.
Yeah.
So some of the behavioral model is basically like building up skill sets so that people can do that sort of stuff more of the time. And that's what I'm going to be talking about for the rest of it. But a lot of this stuff from that perspective kind of looks like common sense because it's stuff you often know how to do.
Yeah. Once you're calmed down enough to be able to see it, which is my understanding of the brain science, when you're not stressed, scared, fearful, when you've got more blood flow to the prefrontal cortex, like your brain isn't in, oh gosh, we have to fight or we have to freeze. It's able to access all of its resources or more of its resources.
You got it. Totally.
Yeah. So that kind of feeds into, both that visualization and what you just said feeds into one of the first questions I had for you, which was how actually do we build that toolkit right now? Me, all of us in the midst of the pandemic fatigue, how do we find meaning and how do we build resilience right now?
Yeah. So one thought I had with this is that it's probably a good idea to start simply, right? And often what that looks like is things that are helping manage your physiological distress. Yeah. And so the idea is that sometimes we are really anxious, or sometimes we're feeling depressed, and really what's going on is like we're underfed and we're underslept, and we haven't done things to actually create the stable foundation for wellness to arise.
Yeah.
So I wanted to go over an acronym that's kind of helpful, just as like a little bit of a self check.
Okay.
That can be helpful, where we just start with that, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of other skills that are helpful.
Okay.
So the acronym comes from dialectical behavior therapy, and it's called Please Master. Right.
Okay.
So please stands for treating physical illness. L is lavish, as in like wash your body. Yeah. E is eat food.
Okay.
Yeah. A is avoid mind-altering drugs. Yeah. S is sleep. And E is exercise.
Okay.
Yeah. And then master is skill mastery. Yeah. And so I'm going to go through each of the physical factors, but the idea is that if you're trying to use skills like socializing, like grief skills, like mindfulness, a lot of that's not going to work super well if the physiology isn't stable first.
So true.
Yeah. So treating physical illness, hopefully that's, like taking your medications, and like if you have a wound, like actually following that up. I had a small cut on my hand that I just left alone for 2 or 3 days, and it's kind of amazing to see actually just how distracted my mind was, right? So making that a priority and really saying like I've got to take care of my body that way. Same thing for lavishing or washing. For the pandemic, a lot of folks have kind of gotten out of their usual hygiene strategies, because a lot of that's usually tied to the morning activity or the evening activity that you do associated with work.
Yeah.
Right. So it's helpful to make sure that that's part of the schedule, kind of whatever feels like a healthy amount for your body.
Mm-hmm.
And that includes, flossing and brushing your teeth and like all the other kind of just, physical hygiene pieces. Yeah.
The taking care of your body pieces, which it sounds like if you start this off with the frame of I'm going to take care of my body.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
That's
absolutely.
Wounds, physical ailments.
Yep.
Power.
Yeah. The E for eating, a lot of people are kind of overworking their stress system, right? Which is often tied to blood sugar. So they're constantly kind of paying attention to news or worrying about the virus, and it kind of creates a condition where they have unstable blood sugar, which is either going to be like anxiety or kind of depressed crash outs. So just making sure that you're eating meals and that you're kind of maintaining blood sugar that way.
Mm-hmm.
Avoiding mood altering drugs. I think a lot of that is looking at is the substance kind of promoting dysregulation, right? So about 35% of Americans right now would qualify for a mental health diagnosis, and I'm betting a large portion of that is excess alcohol use, because people are at home a lot and then trying to use that as a coping strategy. It's kind of promoting dysregulated blood sugar and sleep. It's also not helping the stability of their mood.
Yeah.
Sleep, 7 to 9 hours is the usual amount that adults need. So if you're not getting that, you can always talk with healthcare providers about like strategies in order to pursue that.
Absolutely.
And then exercise. We are a species that is meant to walk quite a bit every day in order to keep all of our body functioning. And so if you're not doing things every day, it's a recipe for mood dysregulation.
That's such an interesting, what you just said. If you're not moving every day, that's a recipe for mood dysregulation. And in fact, what I feel like you're actually saying, pulling back for a moment, is if you're not sleeping well, you're not eating consistently, if you're not hydrated, if you're not caring for your body, if you're not showering or in some way like caring for your hygiene every day, and if you're not moving every day, and also substances, this all together creates a recipe that ensures some degree of mood, dysregulation. And when you add that on top of the pandemic, and the fear of COVID-19, the uncertainty of what comes next in our society, and political, social tensions, like all of that together is going to create ups and downs, anxiety, depression is what and that was such an interesting tie into blood sugar as well,
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think, the parts of our minds that are really dedicated to figuring out what the threat is and then how do we solve that threat, I mean, those are there for really good reasons. We don't actually want to get rid of our threat detection system. But very often we'll find ourselves essentially getting caught in, how do I fix an unsolvable problem, right? How can I fix climate change? How can I fix political instability, right? And that may just not be something we can actually solve. And really what the problem is that we're looking for is the dysregulation, right? So rather than solving the content of mind, you're actually trying to solve the kind of state of mind.
It also seems like this is can turn into a negative feedback loop so fast, where the more that you are stressed and scared, the less likely you might be to do the very things that will help your body to remember that your body is okay. The more your body is not okay, the more that feeds the stress and the anxiety or the depression, and it can kind of do a loop. And so one of the ways you can get out of that just simply is coming back to, have I showered? Have I eaten? Have I had water? Have I slept? Have I moved? And what is my relationship to alcohol, caffeine, sugar, and anything else, maybe? Because any of those can certainly impact in a big way.
You got it. Yeah.
Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. So then kind of going from that, I just feel like there are some folks who are doing better maybe right now and some folks who are struggling more. And it seems to me as a health coach, I often, when I see somebody doing well or somebody not doing well, at this point, after the years I've been coaching, it's like, what are you doing that helps you to be doing well? And what choices are you making that is creating a more challenging circumstance? Because it's not just, what we genetically have. Our choices really impact our experience. So what would your advice be for how people can trend towards skillfully, handling what's happening right now versus choices that lead towards more challenge?
Yeah. Well, so this is part of the kind of like the second part of that acronym, which is the master part, right? And it's mastering skills. And so the idea is that from a stable physiology, if you are still, having mood dysregulation or any difficulties, you can start to lean into kind of more skillful ways of how to respond to major stressors. So I wanna offer one of them, which I think is like, it's always a good one to use, which is, well, let me circle back before I offer skills. Really what we're talking about is resilience. Yeah. And so the definition of resilience is responding well to stress. So there is biological variability. There are some people who, God bless them, they're just amazingly resilient just by their genetics.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there are other folks who, unfortunately, genetically, they're not. They don't process stress hormones as well. And so the idea is that if you might be one of those people who struggles with resilience, there are trainable skills that you can do that make it more likely that you'd be resilient.
Yeah. What are
yeah, so one of them is mindfulness. Yeah. And so the idea with mindfulness is that you only ever have to deal with what's directly in front of you.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it usually turns out that this moment, exactly as it is, it's usually not too bad, right? But that we get caught in trying to solve some sort of future problem that we don't have the variables to solve, right? Or we get caught in the past trying to, address some problem that, again, can't do anything about. Right? Or in the whole field of attention for all the information that's there, our attention will zoom down to the one unpleasant thing that's there.
Focusing on the negative.
Yeah, so part of mindfulness, which is just, it's paying attention to the current moment exactly as it is, helps to kind of train your attention to look at all the kind of neutral and positive things that are there, in addition to the inevitable unpleasant stuff that's also there.
Yeah.
So one way to do this, I like to do a mindfulness technique named as noting. Yeah, and I'll just describe it and kind of practice super quick with you, if that's okay.
Absolutely, yes, please.
Yeah. So the idea with this is that you give like a one-word label for wherever your attention has landed on in that moment, right? And there's basically 7 types of things that you're going to give labels to. The first 5 are your classic 5 senses. Right? So in this moment, if I see an object on my desk, I would just say there is seeing, right? Because I'm having an experience of seeing. Doesn't matter what it's called, I'm just seeing a thing. Same thing for hearing. If I hear something outside, I could just say there is hearing. I could note smelling, I could note tasting. I could note body sensations. I could just say feeling because I'm feeling something. I also might get more nuanced. I could say, itching, vibration, tingling, pain. Yeah. The 6th one is thinking, right? And we'll just leave it at that. You can get more nuanced, but just for mind stuff, we'll just say thinking.
Yeah.
And the 7th one is pass. Don't know. It's just, I don't even know where my mind went. Okay.
I haven't heard
So
of
if I was doing this solo, I would note there is seeing, there is breathing, there is relaxation, there is dryness, there is thinking, pass. Okay. And you can see it's kind of like once a second or two, right? And that becomes a good rhythm in order to just keep the attention going. Yeah. So if you like that sort of stuff, you think it would be helpful, there's lots and lots of resources around town. And I think your clinic actually has a whole kind of list of them, so people can contact you if they want more of that.
Yeah, we do. Absolutely can contact me. We've got a little hub on our website with resource links you can go out to. And quickly, it sounds like what you're aiming to do in the mindfulness practice is basically to practice aperture of focus. So if you're getting like stuck in the fear or stuck in the anxiety, through mindfulness, what you're practicing on doing is having a broader mind focus and just like gently observing what comes up without getting stuck inside of it and in the thought. And then embedded in the story, you're kind of up above. And if you practice that mental muscle over and over, then in the moment when you are feeling stressed, it's easier to say stress. That's what stress feels like. Or thinking.
It's kind of a divide and conquer strategy. Yeah. So if fear and anxiety are showing up, it may sound like fear, anxiety, breathing, seeing, hearing, fear, thinking. Right. It's just like dividing and conquering the experience, and it has less grab that way.
Yeah, absolutely. That's wonderful. Were there any other tactics you wanted to share before we?
Yeah. So the 2 others that I wanted to mention is some of the research on people who are resilient. They really, really know how to tap their social networks. Yeah. So we are a very, very, very tribal species. Yeah. And part of the mechanism when we feel depressed is to isolate. And there's some interesting medical reasons why. I think part of like being in a tribal species and getting sick, there's a just primitive instinct to withdraw ourselves from the tribe so that we don't become a vector for infection. And that works for both mental health and physical health. But it works in the other way as well, that when you are connecting more with people, that it actually has a way of kind of reversing some of the internal feeling of mental and physical illness. So, for like a lot of the typical ways that people would be socially connecting are challenged in our current environment, but that doesn't mean that they're unavailable. And so, like making a priority to do telephone calls, to do Zoom calls, to do outdoor walks, bundle up and cook someone dinner on your porch, like all of those sort of things are still available. They're inconvenient, but they're important.
That's really good. The social contact matters, even if it isn't the kind of social contact we want. Even if we can't do Sunday dinner with our family or going to a cafe with a friend the way we could before. We can still call every day, or we can get together and go for a walk outside in the cold. And in fact, that's really important because doing it seems almost like a proactive way to boost our resilience, even before we're hitting that pressure point.
You got it. Yep. So the last one that I wanted to mention, actually have a little metaphor for you.
Oh, great.
Okay, cool. I have this sharp pen.
Okay.
Would you let me stab you through the hand with this?
No.
You sure?
I mean, what are my other options?
No. Just yes or no. Can I?
No.
Pretty easy, right?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Now, I am a mad scientist,
Okay.
and your kid is desperately sick.
Oh,
I'm the only one in the world who has the cure.
yes, you can stab me through the hand.
And the only way I'll give it to you is if I stab you.
You can stab me through both hands.
Cool, right? Okay. So what
Yeah.
we just did was essentially like most of the time, what people want is the choice of would you like suffering or not suffering? Yeah. And instead, very, very often, what the decision is would you like suffering or would you like suffering with a purpose? Yeah. So
Yeah.
I just assumed that, you know, one of your values was your child, right?
Do you know I have a son? Yes.
Yeah, fair enough, right? But I think it's helpful, like this is one of the things with resilience research is that people who are more resilient, they kind of know what their values are and what they're willing to have more suffering for.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
They're
So,
contextualizing.
yeah, so there are, you know, there are different kind of suggested lists of values, but it's really idiosyncratic.
Yeah.
And there's no inherent like rules about some values being more valuable than others. So,
Yeah.
so for some people it's their children, for some people it's their career development, for others it's civic service or their health or their spirituality, or like it can be all sorts of things, friendships. Yeah. And of course, it changes kind of based on lifetime. Like people's values will shift, but it matters
Absolutely.
now. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so another metaphor that I'll use for this is the idea of heading west, right? So I'm gonna just say one of my values is my marriage, is my relational quality. That's pretty important to me. Yeah. And if I decide heading west is like, you know, improving my relationship quality, the thing is that I could always head further west.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so I can go from here to Tennessee, I can go to Colorado, I can go to San Francisco, right? And like with each step, I'm saying, okay, this is important. How do I head further west?
Yeah.
And so a lot of people will, first of all, mistake actually goals for values. So if I said, well, I got married, therefore I no longer need to value the relationship, right? That would be a problem.
Right.
And then the other thing is that people will kind of mistake obstacles for heading west as being, meaning that they can't value the thing. Right. So if you're heading west, you will eventually encounter the Mississippi River, the Rockies, the Pacific. Like it'll be a time where suddenly the rate of change gets a whole lot harder.
The pandemic.
Oh yeah, the pandemic.
Whatever it might be.
Financial stress, political stress, like
all of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so the idea is it's like in those times, it's really kind of a creative invitation for, well, how can you pursue this value given the context that's currently available?
Okay. So what you're saying is, how can we right now shift from thinking, oh, I can't be with my friends, you know, my husband and my child, and we can't go visit, you know, my mom in Wisconsin, whatever it is that almost feels like I'm a victim to the circumstance and it's hard and it's frustrating, and shift that dramatically to say, well, my core value is family and integrity, or my core values are family, integrity, you know, health, well-being, whatever else it is. And how can right now we be focusing on working to better ourselves in those areas in the midst of what's happening? And this pandemic is one more challenge as we head further west in our living out how to treasure family, how to treasure integrity, etc.
Yeah. And I mean, I think it's not mistaking goals for values, in which if the way that you previously expressed the value was to hop in an airplane for a physical visit, right? That may be now the Rocky Mountains. You can't do that right now.
Right,
You know,
literally.
due to your values of health or due to your value, like, yeah. But then there's a kind of open question of, well, how do I live my values? Like, how can I still show up for what's important, or what am I willing to suffer for? given that not suffering isn't an option right now.
Right.
Yeah.
Things on the table for everyone, and considering that, how can I, with my values, move through and move with this challenge in a way that, it's not just suffering. It's suffering, me honoring what's most important to me on my deepest levels.
Yep. And so this ends up actually being super important for what's known as post-traumatic growth. And so the idea is that like all of us don't want challenge. Yeah. But that's like the stoic response to it is that it sometimes just challenges on the table. You can't get away from it.
Right.
And so it's more about like, well, how can I respond to this that still feels like I'm living in integrity or that I'm expressing my values? And when people find that, it's a really, really interesting psychological transformation in which like you start having more of a value-centered life or more of a growth-centered life, right? Rather than just kind of avoiding discomfort.
Yeah.
And the outcome is more gratitude, more appreciation, more open-heartedness in relationships. Like there's candy on the other side of the dragon.
All right. Yeah. And again, can you repeat exactly what you said was that shift? It's the shift from here's a challenge to here's a challenge and how can I respond in a way that's in keeping with my values?
Yeah, it's no longer allowing whether it's comfortable or not to be like a guiding principle for why you do something. Right?
Yeah.
There's things that are really, really worth it to lean into discomfort around.
Yeah.
And that's a kind of stoic response.
Absolutely. Instead of seeking comfort and staying within that place, seeking how to live out your values regardless of what's coming. Remember hearing an interview with a Stoic philosopher, a philosopher who studied the Stoics, wrote a book about them. And he said something about how the Stoic approach was one of like life, the gods, the fates present these challenges. And it's like a test to see how you can use your strengths and your personal attributes to get around it. And that is what the challenge is, this invitation to like game on. How can we do this?
Yeah.
But that sounds like what you're talking about as well here. And that what that leads to is your guiding light kind of shifts towards your values, and then that expands generosity and relationship value and so on.
Yeah. And it's a greater happiness because, circumstances will change at some point, it will be more comfortable. There will be less, like stressors at some point, right?
Yeah.
And being able to actually have that added joy of even in good circumstances, I still know what's really important to me. I'm grateful for the opportunity that's available now. I'm still going to like take steps, even small steps towards how to live the full life.
Sounds very empowered when you repeat it in that way. It really does. Okay. Thank you for sharing that. So to recap in terms of the strategies to use towards building resilience, mindfulness, noting is one option. Visualizations like you guided me through in the very beginning would be another one where you're really imagining, your compassionate self in the future. And then really paying attention to your bottom line physically. Am I actually really stressed and scared, or am I actually really stressed and scared and also haven't slept for, a day or two and haven't been showering and haven't gone out and moved and haven't talked to a loved one? Really keeping in touch with people. Social contact might be inconvenient right now, but it is so important, perhaps more important than ever, and is a productive way to build resilience. And coming at challenges from values and having, it sounds like, a mental story about why it is that you're going through life the way you want to be right now. That makes sense. Starting to ask of the circumstances, how can I get through this in a way that honors my values?
Yep. Yeah. Good call. Yeah.
And then, I have one last question for you. Do we have time? Because I know that we.
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Grief is, I think, a complicated topic right now. Bereavement and loss, certainly as folks have lost loved ones to COVID-19. And then there's also the complicated grief that is coming from routines that aren't there, a sense of hopelessness about the future, the losses of daily life structure, normalcy, all of that together. What are some skillful ways to grieve right now when circumstances are feeling out of control?
Yep. Yeah, so, grief is usually the emotion that comes up around loss, right?
Yeah.
As is sadness, right? That it's a particularly unpleasant emotion when it kind of shows up.
Yeah.
And so one thing that a lot of us do is that we sometimes have like a little bit of a phobia around unpleasant emotions, right? And it's part of that kind of avoidance or not wanting suffering, is that we'll like whenever it comes up, we'll do whatever it takes in order not to feel it. Yeah.
Yeah. Reptile brain, avoid thing uncomfortable.
Yeah. And of course, it's an important emotion. Our systems evolved to have that particular emotion for a reason,
Yeah.
right? And it's also pointing towards the kind of like psychological research around what healthy grief versus complicated grief looks like. Healthy grief has some of those same factors of resilience, in which like when you have it, there can be more gratitude, more connection, more appreciation for things as they are. So I'll tell you a quick story. My grandfather passed at the young age of 98, about like a year or two ago. Yeah, super.
Wow.
Yeah. And so it's interesting watching him get kind of older and older. And I remember asking him a couple of years before he died, basically like what was it like in order to have lived long enough that essentially everyone that he knew had died before him.
Yeah.
And he'd also served on Iwo Jima, so he saw a lot of death kind of in
Wow.
war. And his response really, really stuck with me, which was that at some point you experience enough death and loss that you just become grateful to have known the person in the first place.
Wow.
Yeah. And so I think there's kind of a similar lesson in there around the pandemic, right? Is that the candy on the other side of the dragon is that there can actually be more appreciation for all of this. Yeah.
Yeah.
The other way that this shows up, so one side of it is basically, it's like if you need time to grieve because that's an appropriate emotion for the loss that's happening, part of the invitation is actually giving yourself time and space to grieve. Yeah. The other part of it is that sometimes grief is like all in your face and it's just left, right, and center, and you can't kind of like make room for it because it needs your attention so strongly.
Yeah.
So the strategy I sometimes like for that is grief scheduling. Yeah, this works for other emotions. This works for worry as well. And the idea is that this is an emotion that really wants your time and attention, right? And so we're going to give it your time and attention on Tuesday at 4 o'clock for half an hour.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And you can pick kind of whatever frequency makes sense. For folks that are struggling a little bit more with it, you might suggest a little bit more frequent, right? So like half-hour bursts or hour bursts, not much longer than that. Say about like 4 times a week. If it's kind of if it has less fangs, then you might trim it down to like once a week. And so then the idea is that when that time comes, you grieve, right? And you grieve in whatever way feels skillful. Your future compassionate self could probably be helpful for that. Sometimes skillful grief, I mean, for me, having pictures of what I'm grieving, writing it letters, making some sort of gesture of affection, very often expressing apologies, forgiveness, and things that I just really wish that I'd had a chance to say at the time, like appreciations or like noticing people's strengths, things like that are kind of good to include in that time, right?
Yeah.
And so then you do whatever kind of feels like it's good grief, like your ideal self, how they would grieve, right? And then at some point the alarm clock goes off, right? And then any other time that emotion starts to show up for the rest of the week, you just basically tell it like,
not that time.
yeah, no, I got you on my schedule. I absolutely will tend to you,
Huh.
right? If it keeps coming up, you might consider just taking a quick note. Oh, okay, I wish I had said this, or I do want to apologize for this, right?
Yeah.
And then when it's your schedule, you open it up, right? And you're basically giving a space where you're allowing yourself to feel an important emotion, but it doesn't take over everything else.
So in terms of where grief can feel overwhelming sometimes, especially when it's fresh and raw, and putting boundaries on it and saying, we're going to open the valve for an hour. And maybe we do this once a week, or maybe we do it a couple times a week, or maybe it's just 5 minutes, but whatever feels like what you need. So asking yourself and saying, what would feel like enough time for that emotion? What does that part of me need? And then scheduling it like an appointment. And probably thinking about how you can bookend that appropriately so that you're not going from intense grieving for a half hour to cooking dinner with your 4-year-old son or whatever it is,
Yeah.
yourself some transition points, and then scheduling it, actually doing it, and then throughout the week as it comes up, just telling yourself, yep, Tuesday at 5, that's when we're going to come back to this. I think that it can seem easy sometimes when grief is overwhelming, or when it's this like uncomfortable pink elephant in your peripheral vision, to just, there's no time for that. Like, I just have to keep doing the thing that I have to do. And then it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And so it's like, this is a very skillful way to commit.
I almost think of it as them like, turning up the stereo louder and louder and louder until it's overwhelming your attention.
Yeah.
So part of mindfulness is being able to kind of catch those things a little bit earlier before they become overwhelming.
Yeah. And that circles back around to how mindfulness can build resilience, because if you're not stuck in this ignoring that it's there and getting bigger and then it's overwhelming and just explodes out, in between, you're able to contend with everything else that's happening more easily, continuing to handle work or family in the midst of grieving.
Solid. Good call.
Yeah.
Just I'll close out kind of with how I started, which is compassion. So I mentioned the like 35% of Americans that are having mental health diagnoses. I don't know how people are supposed to feel during a pandemic, like climate catastrophe, political catastrophe. Like a lot of people are having this. So there's actually a metaphor that I'll kind of close with. It's actually a Buddhist story. It's the mustard seed story. So Buddhism has a mustard seed story as well. And the idea is there's a woman who loses her child in childbirth, and she's utterly devastated, as you can imagine. Yeah,
as you would be.
Yeah. And so she ends up kind of walking around with the body for about like 3 days, and it's really upsetting to everyone that's around her as well. And Siddhartha is teaching in a village a couple ones over, and he has this reputation as a healer, right? And so one of the villagers comes running to him and says, can you help? And he says, yes, I'll be there shortly. I definitely can help. The one thing I need is a mustard seed from a house that death has not touched. And so this woman, she hears this, and she's just on a mission, right? She's going to find out. She's going to get that mustard seed, right? And so she goes to the first one, and they're like, yeah, I mean, we'd love to help, and we have lots of mustard seeds, but my wife died 6 months ago, right? And then moves on to the next one. It's like, oh God, I'm so sorry, but my uncle died, and on and on
and on.
And so kind of through that process of this kind of like horrifying experience, right, she's able to kind of eventually let go and allow her child to be buried. So that story is one of kind of common humanity.
Yeah, and common loss.
Yeah, and I think that's a thing that's up for all of us. The way that we tend to suffer more is that we'll tend to think that we're the only one, or that we're the only one that's struggling, or that no one else kind of knows what this experience is like. And part of the invitation of compassion is that this is actually part of the full human story.
Yeah.
There's other parts. There's plenty of other lovely things that'll show up in the story, but right now it's this.
Makes me think of the Dr. Kristen Neff, who's done a lot of the research into self-compassion. She has a 5-minute self-compassion break, and other free resources on her website. And one of the things that she says in that guided meditation is, like you put your hand on your heart and you talk to yourself as you would to your friend, and you kind of say, this is what suffering feels like. And, it's normal to feel this way.
Yep.
What's happening. And then she guides you through imagining all of the other people in the world who might be experiencing what you're experiencing right now.
Yeah.
I'm so glad that's where you went with that, with your last kind of closing statement, because I think that if what's so hard right now is how splintered we are from each other, doesn't it in some respects make complete sense that part of what could help so much is to tap into how connected we are in the experience of that splintering, how hard that is, and then use the technology we have to creatively connect, despite inconvenience, despite how it's not our normal.
Yeah, and it is the idea that a lot of those people that we struggle with as well are suffering, are suffering in their own particular ways, and we can do our work to essentially be more patient, more perspective taking, more courageous, more calm, more lighthearted, like all of those things that actually help the rest of the tribe.
Yeah. When we help ourselves, we're better able to be there for those we love or those we don't know, whichever. Yeah. Thank you again, Dr. Hamilton, so much for your time and for sharing your guidance and expertise with us. If you have been watching this interview and you want to learn more about Dr. Hamilton, visit his website at behealthavl.com. You have a great resource list on your website as well that I've checked out, and it's just fantastic. And thank you again. Have a great day.